Hey, before we get started, I wanted to share that I've developed a brand new presentation. It's called More Than a Tree, Reaching Your Roots, Standing Tall, and Branching Out. More Than a Tree is a presentation about my experiences with ADHD, discovering that I have ADHD at 50 years old. But it's much more than that. I'll be sharing ways to know yourself, to unleash your hidden superpowers. I'll be talking about respecting yourself and finally, how to find the others, how to find your community, people like you. Please drop by wisesquirrels.com/tree. I'm very excited about delivering this presentation for companies, for conferences, for any opportunities where you feel my message is important. And I would sincerely appreciate you reaching out and letting me know where you think I should be sharing More Than a Tree. Thanks. Host Dave Delaney. My guest today is Rob Hatch, the author of the best-selling book, Attention, The Power of Simple Decisions in a Distracted World. Rob is not only an accomplished author, but also a renowned executive coach specializing in guiding business leaders through critical transitions. We kickstarted our conversation by delving into an intriguing aspect of Rob's life, his late adult ADHD diagnosis. And it was a revelation that shaped his perspective and propelled him on a unique path. Rob's educational background in human development and early childhood education, combined with his experiences as a preschool teacher and administrator of childcare centers in New England, laid the foundation for his career journey. In addition to his work in education, Rob also ran a nonprofit organization dedicated to serving children with special needs and their families. And it was during this time that he discovered his passion for coaching and human development, leading him to his current role as an executive coach. We dive into Rob's transition from the education sector to coaching and how our shared friend Chris Brogan played a pivotal role in connecting those dots. And we reminisce about the early days of Twitter or X or whatever it's called now. We talk about podcasting and social media. One of the key themes of Rob's book is the concept of gaining energy by removing decisions and relying on habits and setting oneself up for success. Rob shares practical strategies like his success blocks and action stacks, and we get into some really great tips for using free tools like Google Keep and Google Sheets. And we also speak about the power of meditation and using transcendental meditation specifically. And we explore the intersection of entrepreneurship and knowing when to quit versus when to push forward, as well as the challenges of having multiple interests and hopping from one passion to another. And finally, Rob gives us a glimpse into his upcoming book, Success Frames, which promises to be another insightful exploration of decision-making and achieving success. And so I began the conversation today by asking Rob when he first realized he had ADHD.
I was diagnosed about a little more than a decade ago, and got the diagnosis because we were pursuing a diagnosis for my oldest son. And all of the things that teachers were saying about him and the experiences he was having just sounded way too familiar. And I started to see myself, and I thought about it like, wait a second, maybe I need to pursue it as well.
Yeah.
And I actually around that same time, had a conversation with a good friend who I went to high school with, and he graduated at the top of his class a year ahead of me and went off to Stanford. And he at the time we were chatting, had just received an adult diagnosis because his son was being diagnosed.
Yeah.
And same sort of thing. But he was recalling being at school, and not in an arrogant way, but he was saying, I'd go to class and I knew I was as smart as the other folks there. And I'd get home at night and I'd sit down to do my homework. And it just seemed like everyone else could just sit down and get their homework done. And with me, he said, I would sit there and I'd say, okay, let's, got to do this. I'd crack open the book or whatever, and I'd start to study. And then some thought would catch his attention, right? And he'd start to drift off, or he'd get up or something. And this is long before there was a screen to contend with, this is the early 90s.
Yeah.
And, he'd sort of like, oh, wait, I got to get back to focusing. And he'd pull himself back and refocus and put the effort in again, trying to like through sheer force of will, make himself focus on the stuff that was going on. And that loop, he said it carried on professionally. And that's when I sort of identified with how he was describing it impacted him as an adult. That constant loop of, okay, I got to focus. And I sit down and I try to get going and might get into it for a little bit, but then something would catch my attention and distract me. And that constant loop of trying to have to pull yourself back and focus. Okay, right. Got to get back to it. And how exhausting that loop is sometimes, all the time, honestly.
Yeah.
And so that's when the bells really started to go off. So I got a diagnosis around that time. My son did. And then many years later, my daughter was also diagnosed. And that was something I actually felt a little guilty about because we missed it for so long with her. It wasn't until she was in her junior year in high school, I think, that she received the diagnosis because it shows up differently for girls.
It does. Yeah. Yeah, it does. It's interesting. Yeah. It's very interesting how it does affect you and how, your focus, of course. And so you were saying, so you were diagnosed like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So, and
that's in my early 40s, basically.
Early 40s. Okay. Yeah. And so I was just diagnosed at 50 and, it was one of those, like personally for me, it was, my wife is a school teacher, and she teaches, she's a librarian at a school and she teaches like middle school and elementary students. So she knows like, kids, and she knows every different type of kid under the sun. And of course they have training in this type of work. So she was always like, you have ADHD. Like she told me so many times and I was like, whatever. And, it finally, for me personally, actually, I'm in a mastermind with two other entrepreneur fellas, and the three of us kind of, we meet once a week, for an hour plus and kind of, riff on our businesses and challenges and blah, blah, blah. And one of them knows me quite well and I've known him for a long time. The other one I didn't know at all. And the one who didn't know me at all, or I didn't know at all, texted me one day, maybe after about a month or 2 months of these types of meetings. And he just texted me out of the blue. He's like, dude, do you have ADHD? And I said, no. And he said, I think you do. And because he also has ADHD. So he's like, no, seriously, like you should go see your doctor. Tell me a little bit more about your background. Cause I know you've worked in the sort of entrepreneurial digital marketing space for as long as I've known you. What was your background before you're working in that industry specifically?
I worked in the field of early childhood education. I went to school for human development and early childhood ed. I was a teacher in preschool classrooms, toddler classrooms, infant classrooms for years, and then moved into administration, running childcare centers in and around Massachusetts, and then overseeing some in out throughout New England. But my last role before I left all of that behind, and that was running a nonprofit that served children with special needs and their families. So I've been around it a lot, and I'm sort of surprised that I didn't catch it sooner. But I think with really young children, it just shows up in very different ways, and you don't see, like I said in the story I shared with you about my friend, I needed to hear it in the context of my work, or something that sounded familiar. And I also think at the time, 10 years ago, the way in which it was described, it was stereotyped. It was this, the overactive, talkative boy, can't focus, whatever stereotypes get laid on it. which is also why girls are harder to diagnose. It tends to be, all the symptoms to get applied to boys. But I, for whatever reason, I just didn't see it in myself. But as soon as I had actually, even after diagnosis, I got diagnosed, I got treated, but I still didn't understand it. And really, it's only been in the last, I'd say, 4 or 5 years that I've come to understand how it's impacted me more and more. Just in the way it shows up, and things that I thought were quirks of mine that turned out to be like, oh, that's a very common ADHD thing, like having multiple interests, for example. And, there was a funny little meme that was going around at one point, kind of tell me you have ADHD without telling me you have ADHD. And this guy was, I'll give you my version of it, walking around the house with his video, with his phone showing, all right, so here's all the fly fishing gear from when I was really into fly fishing for, several years. Here's my triathlon gear for when I was really into doing triathlons. Here's all my archery stuff from when I was into that for a while. Here's all my magic cards. Here's my, here's my comic book collection, whatever. Yeah. And I felt obviously very seen, cause I could see I have all that stuff gathering dust now because the interest is there and really intense. And then all of a sudden it just goes away. Yeah. Like, as much as I want to do all of those things, like the spark is gone, it's hard to restart. So my background was in early childhood ed, and, I bring that into the work I do today, which is more, I'm an executive coach, and, I find that the focus of human development obviously comes into play. And it's also very helpful now knowing what I know about myself and my ADHD. One example is that all of my coaching calls are done via audio. I am an auditory processor. I could hear inflections in people's voices. There's something about not having the distraction of having to watch them on Zoom or even be in person, that I can just really focus on what's being said and really dive into, asking questions and hearing, oh, you said this in the first 5 minutes, but you said this, 15 minutes later, and now you just said this, and I'll tie those threads together. My brain seems to work well to hold on to those things. We're,
in this sort of pandemic, post-pandemic sort of era where, everybody and their mother knows how to use Zoom. How do you find that your clients are asking or curious why you're not using Zoom as opposed or video conferencing as opposed to audio?
I explain it up front. I let them know that I just usually stick to I'm an auditory processor and I can hear things better. And as long as they're comfortable, then I've had no problem. There's been a few who have asked for video calls and I've done them and it's been just fine. I can make that work. It just there's a cost to that for me. In terms of my energy that I have to expend to remain really keyed in on who, what they're saying. And so I just try at every point throughout my day to arrange things so that I'm not expending costs that I don't have to. Taxing my energy.
Yeah. For me personally, as a speaker, and I do a lot of workshops and keynote presentations and things like that. A lot of, certainly virtually speaking, of course, all of that is on over, video, Zoom, what have you. But I've actually learned quite a lot about using video. Well, first of all, I should back this up by saying I like your approach, and I think that's a better way to do it. And personally speaking, as a podcaster, I am a old school podcaster. I started podcasting in 2005. And so, but it's always been audio, and I'm kind of a purist that way. Like we're recording this right now over audio only and no video. And I think you can have a better conversation that way. But I was going to mention with the video calls, one thing that I've learned, and something that when I teach people how to have better Zoom calls or virtual presentations, it's to turn off your self view, turn off your own camera, or not turn off the camera, but turn off your view of yourself, because there's even studies now that show that that is part of what is soul sucking when you're on endless Zoom calls, is you end up looking at yourself. And I use the analogy of like Flavor Flav from Public Enemy with his, you know, his clock around his neck, like a necklace. And instead picture like meeting somebody in a hallway, but even Flavor Flav, let's say, but instead it's a mirror. And it would just be so bizarre to talk to somebody while looking at yourself. And that's exactly what's happening. And so these studies have shown that they do, like, looking at yourself all day can certainly make you lose energy. And it's especially difficult for women, apparently, from studies that have shown that, because women typically, generalizing, but according to the studies I've read about this, women are more judgmental of themselves, more self-critical, and from their appearance. And so either way, you're staring at yourself. And so instead, like, of your, you know, beforehand, yes, you can turn it on, check for the spinach in the teeth, turn it off, and away you go. But yeah, having it off is definitely a big benefit. So you're not staring at yourself.
Yeah, I only learned about that in the last year or so, I'd say. And because I do lead some workshops virtually, and obviously having to be on video, that's, you know, it's not that I can't do it or won't do it. Like I said, it's just more, there's a cost to doing it that way, but energy cost. But I lead a monthly mastermind with a group of small business owners, and that, you know, twice a month I'm on video that way. And that, you're right, turning that off has been a game changer for sure. Just the amount I can really feel like I can put into watching reactions of other people rather than just catching a glimpse of yourself. Yeah.
And tell me a little bit. So, and you, at some point you made a pivot out of, you know, child services or, you know, early childhood development into sort of more of your coaching and entrepreneurial work. Tell me about, like, what that was like, and did ADHD play a part in that transition? Obviously it was part of your operating system and still is, like me, but was the timing around that time that you did, like 10 years ago, or tell me about that?
No, it was a little before the diagnosis. Actually, I was pulled away by my good friend Chris Brogan. He was really taking off after his first book, Trust Agents with Julian Smith, and, you know, getting busy and on the road. And we had been friends since grade school, and we're chatting. We'd been kind of coaching each other for years. And he approached me to say if I would come help him run his organization, as things were kind of taking off. And at first I said no, because I loved what I did. Yeah. And then eventually just, I needed to find a way to be able to embrace kind of a mission or a focus to it, rather than just sort of leaving something behind, you know, because I loved what I did. I loved the mission of what I was doing. I loved the organization. And so it really had to have some meaning for me. And I was able to figure that out. And then, I worked with Chris for about 11, 12 years, I think. And so we ran a business together and, you know, created courses and webinars and all of that stuff. And I started doing more writing myself and created courses of my own and coaching and things like that.
Chris and I go way back as well. And we met in 07 or 08 at the podcast New Media Expo. I mentioned earlier being kind of old school with podcasting, and certainly that was definitely one of those old school events. And we knew each other on Twitter, I think, and then met in person at that conference for the first time. And you know, Julian Smith, his co-author of Trust Agents, was also there. And I've known Julian since 04 or 05, because we're both Canadian, and also we're pretty heavy into the Canadian podcast community there. So both
I miss
are
those early days of Twitter, man. Just to think, you know, like they used to call Chris the mayor of the internet at that, you know. Yeah. Like he used to wear that hat.
Yes.
You know, he had a hat when he'd go to events, and there was it was such a, I mean, there's still people, like you said, there are so many relationships from just that time period.
Well, I do think too, like reflecting on that time of kind of the early days of social networks and social media, when it was, social networking and new media, and even before that with BBSs. But I'm really dating myself now. But but I found a lot of it was kind of lonely nerds online trying to find people to connect with and find communities. And we were excited, certainly speaking for myself, I was excited about these new ways of connecting and meeting people. It was just such a cool thing. And then, from those early days of like Twitter, and I started on Twitter in February 2007. Of doing like meetups and tweetups and going to these conferences where you would meet your virtual Twitter friends or your podcast listeners or the podcast hosts of the shows you listen to, and you'd meet these people in person for the first time. And I'm a big believer in how proximity builds the relationship, or takes that relationship to the next level. So you can have like lots of, quote unquote friends or really acquaintances online. But once you meet up in person with the hugs, high fives, handshakes, suddenly that takes that relationship to the next level. And suddenly you're like, oh, in real life.
Yeah, it really is fascinating. And to see how many people, we're still connected in some way. Everyone's gone on to do other things.
Yeah.
But, so many folks, can trace some of their deep friendships back to those early days, in professional relationships. And, it's really remarkable. Well, that's definitely something I miss. And, in the morning, first thing when I was still working at that organization, getting on Twitter like you said, I joined in, I think it was February of 2007 as well. Yeah. And just getting on and, doing a morning water cooler, and talking with Becky McRae and Jeff Pulver and Chris and, CC Chapman, just having all these conversations was really fun.
Yeah. Yeah. And all of them, have appeared in the many presentations I've, delivered over the years talking about this topic specifically. So yeah, it's pretty cool. You've written a book that just came out, and it's called Attention, the Power of Simple Decisions in a Distracted World. Tell me, well, first of all, congratulations on writing the book.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I must admit, I haven't read it yet, but I'm excited to grab it and dig in soon enough. Tell me a little bit about the book and, what are some of the cool things that you've learned and share in the book?
So one of the things that I talk about straight away is something I wrote down on a little scrap of paper, and I'm sure it's still around somewhere because it was something it sort of hit me and I saved it. And it was just this phrase, put success in your way. And the idea being that I wanted to find a way, if I have to think about, if I'm in bed, for example, and I want to get out the door to go for a run, the hardest part for me is the space between the bed and the door. Once I'm outside, I'm absolutely fine. And so I wanted to figure out how to basically put success in my way and eliminate all the decisions I had to make to get out of the bed and out the door. If I had to think at all about where are my shoes? Where's my, where are my headphones? Where's this? Where's that? If I had to think at all about that, my brain would get derailed. If I checked anything, if I picked up my phone and started checking email or social media first thing in the morning, my brain would kind of get derailed. So I started breaking down what that needed to look like and why that was. And I basically put success in your way is kind of based on 3 core elements. The first is that willpower our willpower is limited, that it can deplete throughout the day, that we don't have this endless source. It can be replenished, but over time throughout the day, it can get taxed. And if I'm going to apply any willpower in a situation, I want to apply it when I'm running and it's hard, rather than using my willpower to get out the door. And the same with decisions. The more decisions we make, our ability to make subsequent decisions depletes throughout the day. So when we tax our brain with all sorts of little tiny decisions, we're using up our decision-making energy. And I'd rather apply those decisions to that decision-making energy to bigger things. And the other is just, the power of habit, just how powerful our ability to form a habit is. It's, part of our biological makeup to be able to form habits. And, trying to figure out how do I make this as simple as tying my shoes. I don't have to think about, is it, do I go over the top? Do I go under? I just do it.
Yeah.
So the idea of Put Success in Your Way was just to eliminate as much of that as possible, remove decisions, remove the need to exert willpower, and to make something as possible. So that's part of the premise of that. And it really came to light for me when I was away working. Actually, I was away on vacation with my family. It was early on when I was working with Chris. We just had a lot going on, a lot of courses we were launching, so I still had some, even though I was on vacation, I still had some work that I needed to get done. And I would get up so as not to, disrupt my family. I got up super early and just chose I'm just going to work on these 3 things. I'm not going to do anything else. I'll get up early. I won't disturb my family. I'll knock them out. Not going to check email. Just get those done and move on. And I got so much done that week during those little small chunks. I came home and I worked with a good friend of mine, Becky McCrae, who I've been coaching with for years, and just kind of broke down why that was, what made things go so smoothly. Why did I feel so productive in that 2-hour time block? And how can I replicate that at home? So I started to look at, it was, I limited the amount of time. I limited the amount of projects I was working on. I said I would work on 3 for 45 minutes each. I turned off all my distractions. I, made sure that there were no interruptions. And so I started setting up my day that way as well when I came back. So each night I would prepare ahead of time. Like I still do this. At night, I make decisions the night before about what I'm going to work on, what I'm going to start, what are the 3 most important things. I call it my success block. And in doing that, the decision's made for me. I'm not making an emotional decision, or a decision that's, been distracted by an email that came in, because I have a rule not to open my email until after my success block.
Nice.
So I call it my success block because if I get those 3 things done, then even if the rest of the day goes haywire, I determined that is what success looks like for me for that day. I still do lots of other work, but at least I've got those 3 most important things worked on and moved a project forward or whatnot. So that, that's kind of, in a nutshell, that's a lot of what the book is about. And what I didn't realize at the time, even when I wrote it, because it came out in 2020, and even from 2020 to now, understanding my ADHD, I realized that the book is in many ways a collection of coping mechanisms for keeping me focused. And some of the biggest response were ADHD communities and people who are coaches for ADHD folks. And, it's people who coach on organization and helping, particularly those who are challenged by organizing, like folks with ADHD, that have gravitated and spoken highly of the book as well. So at the time, I even though it was called Attention, I still didn't even quite make realize, I guess, how much it resembled just all of the coping mechanisms that have helped me to stay focused.
Yeah, I would love to actually do a study or something and find out the ADHD diagnosis or of all of the all the productivity experts, right? From David Allen, Mike Vardy and Eric Fisher and all these folks to get an idea of whether they do or don't, because it certainly seems It certainly seems that way because, yeah, I've written quite a lot of, blog posts and newsletters and things over the years. And even in my book, New Business Networking, I write about it too, about different, like habit forming stuff and focus and ways to focus and ways to eliminate distraction. And then, but that was like you, or, I didn't really, it was before I even considered I had ADHD. So it was just kind of, as you said, like coping mechanisms without even realizing it.
And what I would love to hear the results of that study as well.
Yeah.
I think, and honestly, who better to learn from than someone who struggles, but has found something that works. And I've had to, time and time again, I've written a weekly newsletter for going on 12, 13 years now. And I try really hard to make sure that people don't think that this is easy for me. Yeah. That I don't have everything figured out. My desk gets messy. My life is not completely and utterly organized.
Yeah.
It's because it's hard that these things are in place. And there's so many little systems that I use to keep me focused. One of my favorites is, and this is in the book as well, it's called action stacks. And Chris and I kind of came up with this together. I'm not sure, when we did it, but we were chatting one day. And for action stacks is really simple. It's just a simple plan to keep you focused on, like a checklist. Basically, think of it as a pre-flight checklist. Basically, if you're a pilot, right? And for me, if I'm, just like with your podcast, I'm sure you know how to do all of the setup. And when I was, when we were producing more webinars, I knew how to set everything up and send out all the, set up the automation sequences and send all the notices out and all that. I knew it inside, my inside and out, and I could do it, from memory. But the way my brain works, I would go step 1, step 2, step 7. Oh, wait, step 3, step 5, step 4, and eventually I get it all done and it would be fine. But I'm expending all this energy trying to remember and make sure and double check. And so I just started creating these little action stacks that anytime I have to do something, even if I know it really well, I just pull it up and I just check the item off as I'm going. I use Google Keep because you can use, you can use anything, but Google Keep has this feature where as you check things off, it crosses them off and drops them to the bottom. And then at the end, I can uncheck all and it just restores the whole checklist back to the way it was.
Oh, nice.
And so that for me is really helpful. And again, just a way to stay focused on and not turn it into some creative, like setting up a webinar. It doesn't need to be a creative endeavor where I'm like, thinking about, how do I want to do this time? Like, no, it's simple. It just do it in order, set it up and move on to more interesting things.
So do you do a search on your machine or do you have these like bookmarked or something where you have like webinar action stack or blog post action stack or what have you?
Yep. It's all in Google Keep and they're all labeled and, or tagged or whatnot. And I type in the name of what I want and it comes up.
That's great.
Go through it. And I learned this from some folks, adding the links to the software. And so instead of just saying open Zoom, go create the webinar in Zoom, I put the link right next to the words create, so every piece of software I use in each step, the link is right there to what I need. So it's just such a treat, honestly, to have what you need available and not have to search for things. And I always feel great when that's the case. It's like, I sort of always say, it's like having a little robot butler. I programmed this to serve me what I need.
Yeah. And I like what you were talking about earlier too, about like those 3 things, your success block. I came up with something that's worked well for me. Again, with the note that, some days I'm out the window, I'm like distracted by whatever. But it's, I use Google Sheets and I have a spreadsheet and I have like Monday through Friday on the spreadsheet. And then I have 3 columns or 3 rows, and it's like, I call them like my most important thing of the day. So there's 3 MITs. So there's 3 most important things, and I write them in usually the night before, sometimes the morning of, but I'll write the 3 most important things that I have to do in the day. And then I color the cells, like I fill each cell with like red, and it's like, in Google Sheets, it's like blood red. It's so dark. And then if I start working on it, I turn it yellow or orange, almost like street lights, right? And then once I've knocked it out and done it, I turn it green to indicate that it's been done. And sometimes, I don't get the orange thing finished, so I drop that down as orange into the next day until I am able to turn it green. And then I have some other rows for additional notes and some other stuff. But
love that.
And I found the visual. The visual, and it's also bookmarked as my main tab. So when I use Chrome. And so when I open the Chrome browser, that's the first tab that opens. Also, I find that helpful, awesome. But I like your method with it. And I also like the idea of, something that I've been working on and continue to work on is not checking my email in the morning, because I mean, talk about a danger. It's like the swamp and especially for ADHD minds, it's, I mean, I do all my work or so much of it in the inbox. And so it just distracts me so badly. So I'm trying to be more proactive there.
It's hard. And as we've both confessed, not perfect at it. So, there are days when I don't follow my rule or whatever. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that I try to do in there is, I used to work with a guy. His name was Ron Hood, and he said if it happens more than twice, it needs a system. Mm-hmm. And he was a natural systems guy. He could build and just the most elegant, beautiful systems. It seemed almost easy for him. Mm. But in saying that, I kept thinking, okay, so if if you and I are emailing more than a handful of times, you're going to get a label, and you're not going to hit my inbox anymore. I'm going to filter you to a place. And so if I get, I had one for Chris when we were working together. And so any emails from him they wouldn't even hit my inbox. It would go right there. And those were my priority inboxes. I would check anything from clients, check something from Chris, check something from my wife, mm-hmm. But I skipped the inbox entirely so that I didn't have to, because it's about the decisions for me. Every single line that I'm reading, I have to decide, am I opening this or not? Is this important? Is it not? Mm. And think about, a line of 20 of those. And even if I'm just glancing, I am making some decision to open them or not, to address it now or address it later. And I don't want to do that. I want to, so I keep trying. Every month or so, I'll go through and refilter and make sure that everyone's put in their place, and just so that it serves the most important folks for me. So stuff still hits the inbox, but fewer.
Yeah. So what are some other tips that from your book about, managing time and sort of overcoming decision fatigue, which is something that, I think a lot of us experience in a day?
My favorite one actually is the lowest tech one. Mm. And it's something I learned from years ago. I was taught transcendental meditation. Mm-hmm. The idea there was, there are thoughts that are going to come up when you're trying to focus, right? You're trying to clear your mind or whatever, but there are going to be thoughts that come to your head. And it was this idea of like, just let them bubble up and let them go, and then kind of gently return instead of trying to fight it away.
Yes.
Just kind of let the thought pass through and bubble out of your head. Well, aside from my device or email or notifications, the biggest intruder of my attention is my own mind going, oh, don't forget to call your mother. Don't forget you've got to make a doctor's appointment. Don't forget you got to call the school about your daughter's meeting, whatever it is. And so as I'm working, I would say to myself, oh, let me just do this right now before I forget. Mm-hmm. And so I'd end up just jumping around doing all those little tiny things all day long and never get to my success block stuff before I had one. Never get to those most important things. now I just, so the taking that concept of letting the thought bubble up, I have a blank piece of paper and a pen next to me. And so I use my blank page to capture those thoughts as they come so I don't forget them, because I will forget them.
Oh, I do the same thing. This is funny. Yeah, keep going. Sorry.
It's so great I capture it. And then when I have a free moment, I either put it into my little, onto my daily sheet or wherever I'm going to get to, or I'll take care of the call then. But I find that I'm able to return to what I was supposed to be working on, rather than, being distracted by the thought. Because every time you break attention, the cost of what you've lost and the energy required to get back is so great for me. And I think many people, even without ADHD. I capture. I'm glad so you do the same thing. It works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So as I said, because I have my own sort of daily meditation practice and have had that since really I've dabbled with meditation and mindfulness over the years, but in 2020 when just a pile of stuff was stressing me out, decided to go full on and among other things, but so I got really serious about it. And it's interesting because I've read how meditation is thought to, thicken your prefrontal cortex of your brain. And so, and that's the part of your brain that's involved with focus and planning and impulse control. So, and apparently it also raises dopamine levels, which of course, if, for those listening with ADHD, like we're all craving, that dopamine that neurotypical people, tend to get really easily. And we're kind of craving it. So, but I found, one thing I found, and I talk to friends sometimes. I mean, I'm not preachy about it, but I'll, if I'm talking about meditation with friends, or I have a buddy, and he always comes back with the thing that you as someone who practices meditation, you hear a lot from others, which is, I tried it, but I couldn't, focus on my breath long enough. I couldn't get the thoughts out of my head. So, it just didn't work for me. And to your point, it was a revelation for me in the guided meditation that I was doing at the time. The guide explained, he said, if you have a thought, like let it play out like a movie in your head. And what happens when you do that is rather than getting annoyed with yourself for thinking about whatever, you just let it roll and let it play out. And what happens is typically that thought just kind of like a movie just kind of plays and ends. And you're like, oh, okay. And then you can just return back to the breath. And it was a revelation for me, because you realize like these deep thoughts that are distracting you from your practice are really just thoughts, and they last mere seconds at that. And and then, you can just move on from there.
And I love that, it in the same way, we both sort of were given permission. Like, this is normal. Yeah. And I find that's actually been one of the most helpful things about people talking about ADHD and how it shows up for them is normalizing. There's certain things that are frustrating. There's also some things that I love about it. Mm-hmm. But hearing that it's normal, and then it for me, it stops the self-talk that is so negative, the negative self-talk, that comes in when you're fighting, like, I can't meditate. I can't think, it's not that you can't, as you're pointing it out. It's just that I don't know about you, but I get caught up in this. Here we go again. You didn't follow through, because not only is the meditation frustrating, but then when I quit something like that, I'm frustrated by, I'm frustrated with myself for not following through. And there's so much negative self-talk that comes with ADHD that now that I know more about it and understand it more, and I have my systems to support me, I get less frustrated with myself for not being what I think is like everyone else. Or why can't I just, like my friend who was saying, how is it that I can't do this homework when everyone else seems to be just doing it easily? Am I not as smart as I think I am? Or
yeah. Well, and when we talk about like self-doubt and that kind of thing as it applies to folks with ADHD especially, but anyone listening, yeah, I mean, I wrote my first book in 2013, and that was a long time before I was diagnosed and treated for this. So, and man, like it was brutal. Like, cause I had a contract with a publisher. I had chunks of my book due at certain dates, and I was contractually obliged. And man,
Right.
it was brutal. It was a really rough, not to mention the natural self-doubt, and imposter syndrome that occurs for authors of all stripes and shapes and sizes. And I to the point that I spoke with other friends who are other authors, and I also Googled stuff about self-doubt for authors, and it's very common. But of course, they would all say, just push through, don't worry about it, you're okay,
Right.
and that kind of thing. But man, it was without my wife, I never would have published or finished the book, let alone that. Tell me a little bit about the meditation side. So how did you get into meditation or TM as it's called? When did you? I haven't practiced TM, but I have been intrigued by it.
I was young, 16 or 17 years old, and I had lost my father at the age of 15 suddenly, and my mother, very just an unbelievably kind, loving soul that she is, just gave me so much room to explore. And I moved out for a little bit, lived with an aunt, and so what part of that, she's like, you can do this, but I'd love it if you went to therapy as well. And so it was going to therapy and getting that sort of support and being introduced to it, and so that's when I learned it, but I've not, I go through these sort of fits and spurts of practicing it. It comes in handy. I remember what it is, how to do it. And I will return to practice over and over again, but it's not something I still do every single day, without fail. Some of the things that are frustrating about it for me is ideally you're supposed to do it twice a day for 20 minutes.
Wow.
And it's always been a very big roadblock for me. That idea that there's an ideal rule actually has always been that, not just with meditation, with anything. Anytime someone says, you must do this way, I can be sure that I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
And which is why, so I'll finish answering the question, which is that's when I learned it, and I've maintained my practice off and on, over the years. And it does, when I do it, it really does. It's remarkable the impact that it has when I can find the space, and I can feel the shift. After a few days of getting back into it, I just feel immediately more relaxed. And because with ADHD, the other fun side effect is it comes with a nice big helping of anxiety, and my brain is our brains are always working on some problem, imagined or otherwise. It helps. It definitely helps me to calm the mind and stay focused.
How does it differ? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask how does it differ from, your standard, meditation practice? Like you mentioned, and I do understand that it's 2 sessions per day, 20 minutes per that or per session. But there's a mantra involved, and that mantra is assigned to you, or tell me a little bit about that part.
And I don't know how they do it, how they choose it, but there's this, I think there was a gender element, there's an age element, and they have certain mantras that are assigned, and I still remember mine and still use mine. And it's changed. I've looked them up online, just to remind myself what it was at one point when I felt like, am I sure that I was doing the same one right? And there it was. It wasn't mine individually. It was, there are other people who have that mantra because they were assigned it at this time. They were of a certain age or gender or whatever the rules were, but the teacher is taught how to assign that. And so you don't repeat it out loud. You really are just saying it in your mind over and over again. And it, the idea for me, the way it was explained, and both in the teaching, and then I read a book by the founder of it, the Maharishi Yogi. I read it around the same time. And that's where I got that description of the thought bubbling up. So if you think of it like the surface of water, it's kind of rough at the, at the top with the wind blowing and everything else. And you go down and then the thought comes up and you just kind of let the bubble take you to the surface again. And then you gently re-enter. And the key for me has always been the gentleness, because I am, as we were just talking about, I can be very hard on myself. And so being gentle, returning gently, every time you return after that thought dissipates, you go a little deeper. You seem to go a little deeper, and it just gets calmer and calmer. And so that process of letting go and returning and letting go and returning is just a very gentle process. And you're just saying the mantra in your head over and over again.
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting to me. And then, I've seen a bunch of ads online lately for David Lynch, the film director, has.
Yes.
Yeah, and I keep seeing these ads, and I'm like, and I love David Lynch's work, so I'm like, maybe I should.
He's a practitioner.
Yeah.
And Jerry Seinfeld was also a famous practitioner of that.
Yeah, he speaks very highly of it as well.
Yeah, yeah, and. It's also where, the Beatles famously visited with Maharishi Yogi way back in the 60s. I don't know that they continue to practice, or any of the surviving Beatles continue to practice that. But it was very popular for a while. And a lot of famous folks, it seems, have found their way to it.
Well, I'll let you know if, when I'm speaking with Paul McCartney on the podcast, I'll let you know what he says.
Yeah, dude. And tell him I said hello, by the way. It's been a while.
So a little while back, you mentioned what, what you love about ADHD. Tell me some of the traits or the things that you do like about ADHD.
Well, it actually goes back to the way that I like to coach too, which is, being an auditory processor. Like when I can really focus on what someone's saying, and I'm working with someone, I don't know how else to describe it other than to say it's exciting, and things light up when I'm hearing people say things and the connections that I'm seeing in what they're saying. Mm-hmm. And I attribute that to my ADHD and just sort of being able to think broadly, or not be confined to one way of thinking. I think that's an aspect of ADHD, is because you have a lot of interests, or I do, because it sort of has driven a lot of interests. I feel like I can step into a room and have a reasonably meaningful conversation with anyone. Yeah. Or listen to them and kind of understand what they're talking about, even if I don't know a lot about the topic.
Yeah.
I can get there pretty quickly, and it feels, I attribute that to just the ADHD mind, and it's always been very fun for me to do that and just be able to sit in there in a space and just listen. A lot with my coaching practice, I just sat down recently and listed all the different industries that I've coached in, and we're crawling up towards 80 different industries.
Yeah.
Like I don't know, anything about these many of these industries, and yet, I can help someone, in make a decision, or put them in a position where they feel confident about a decision just by listening to what they're saying. And that's a lot of fun for me.
Yeah, I find that interesting too. A lot of the advice you hear in entrepreneurship and public speaking certainly, as well as kind of niching down and finding your niche and all this stuff. But at the same time, I've kind of landed on sort of ultimately helping people with communication skills, and that could come through multiple ways, through like presentation skills or public speaking or whatever it is. But I have found that like my messages, while I do hone my presentations and training for specific industries, still it's ultimately it's pretty agnostic to industries. I'm kind of pretty broad that way. And I think, yeah, to your point, I think that's part of it. Something else that I've struggled with and actually mentioned online a few times to folks and never really heard what I wanted to hear, which was, and this is pre ADHD in the conversation, but, I'll go to a restaurant and have a great meal and be like, man, I want to learn how to cook better. Like I want to improve my cooking skills and get home and then I'll put on the TV. Like even as a little kid, I would go see like, let's say Superman, and I would be running around after like Superman, trying to figure out how to fly and, and,
yes.
And I'm like this all the time where I see something of interest. Last year I did 6 open mics, comedy sets in 6 weeks and started experimenting with stand-up comedy. Comedy has always been something that I've done in improv. Like I've done a lot of improv, and that plays into some of the training I do, but I never done stand-up. And so I started doing stand-up and then I kind of fizzled out a little bit. And I find this happens with me all the time. I start something and then I get bored of it or I get distracted and then it's gone again. And then it's like up but when you work for yourself, part of the challenge of running your own business is letting your friends, family, network know what you do so that they can recommend you. And when they don't know, I remember I was on a panel once with another digital marketing name, popular fella on the panel. And we were doing a panel and he had commented like, look at his his Twitter feed. Like nobody knows what the hell he does. Yep. And it was true because there's so many facets to me and so many interests and things. So I don't know if there was a question there, but what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think it goes back to, what I was sharing with you, that idea of like, I've got fly fishing gear and my canoe over here and my triathlon stuff.
Yes.
I hop around from interest to interest in the same way. And I used to beat myself up for not following through. This is another one of those sort of negative self-talk things like, wow, how come I just can't stick with one thing? And then when you start to realize like, no, this is something, it's a positive. I embrace it now. And I think it's what keeps it really interesting for me. And I struggled with the same thing for years. My mother could never describe what I do. Now that I can just say, most of my focus is being an executive coach and, writing books. So that's given her something to talk about a lot better.
Yeah, it certainly helps.
But for years, what do you do again? You're online with something and you do courses and maybe some marketing,
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Whatever you want to make.
Yeah. And you're like, what day is it? Okay. Right. Today I'm, yeah.
and I've questioned the same thing about sort of niching down. And for me, it was about, with the coaching in particular, is just, I want to help people make, good decisions. I want to help them do their work better. That's really how I sort of talk about it now is all my writing I do that in a number of different ways. I do it through writing. I do it through coaching. It's just what I do, and putting people in a position to make good, make the best decision for them. You mentioned something about being agnostic about, many things. Like I don't care what software people use.
Yeah.
And when you were describing your system for staying focused on your MITs, I love that you created it as something, you studied productivity. You said you have followed and read about it and written about it, but it's, for me, none of the systems that other people created ever worked. I could never do things the way that people describe them. And it took me years to kind of create, it's not that it's, completely and utterly unique, but I had to find something, a way that would work for me.
Yeah.
And that, to me, I think is also at the core of a lot of folks who are neurodivergent, whether it's ADHD or even folks with autism, that being told exactly what to do sometimes gets in the way. And so we need more space to kind of figure out the best way for us and have a hand in creating what works for us. I think, in the workplace, that's something that I've been focusing on a lot. And the next book that will be out at the end of this year is called Success Frames. And it's really about creating, rather than a very rigid formula, following a formula has never worked for me, but a framework. I can build a framework, kind of general supports, and there's a flow to what I do. And there's I approach things, I can approach certain things in a similar way, and I can adapt that framework to work for me in multiple scenarios. And I find also that I learn more about myself from what went well than what went wrong. Like, there's more lesson in the success than there is the failure for me. Like, okay, that worked. Great. I'm going to keep doing that because it keeps working until I need to adapt it in some way. That idea of not being locked into one system, of giving people, particularly those with ADHD, some flexibility and some say in the matter of creating something that works for them based on their strengths, their interests. That's when you're going to get the most out of someone. In a workplace?
Are there points, especially with somebody with ADHD, are there points to identify when you should quit, when something's not working, or should you stick it out and be patient and keep trying? Like, at what point do you take the boat to the dock and call it a day and, forget about the fishing gear? Like, do you have any thoughts there on when to call it quits?
It's a really great question. I don't know that I have a trigger for when to call it quits other than when the interest sort of wanes. But there are times when I know that I need to persist in something. It's so I want to give up on something. If it's a difficult project, my job, my focus is how do I make this at least a little bit easier and more enjoyable, particularly if it has to get done. So I don't want to abandon that. But I've never been afraid of just walking away from, like, if I'm not interested in something anymore, I'll switch. I've switched careers. I've switched jobs. I've switched, passions or interests. That's always been kind of easy for me to make that switch because it's just, I find the next interesting thing.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know how to answer the question, I think, as directly as you're asking it.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing, right? Because I've brought up podcasting several times here, and and as I mentioned, my wife and I started podcasting in 2005, and we had this parenting podcast, and we did the show on and off for like 3 years. Now there were some other reasons why we decided to stop doing the show, mainly because our babies were becoming people, and we didn't really have their consent to talk about them before they could talk, at least. And so kind of wound things down. But beyond that, I sometimes think there's a lot of different things I think like, oh man, like if we had kept the podcast going since 2005, we'd be like sitting on a mountain of money right now. We'd be like Pampers would be paying for our kids to go to college. And, dang, why don't we stick it out with that? And rinse and repeat that mind frame for, all sorts of different things that I've done over the years. But yeah.
I have a few of those as well. And I'm sure there's an argument to be made for sticking it out. Like you said, you could be maybe more financially well off, having done that. At the same time, at the time you were making that decision, it seems like you made it based on the best available information.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You made it around, you made it together as a family, with the interests of your kids in mind, and what you wanted to talk about, and can we continue to do this? And so, to me, as long as you can look at the decision you're making and all of the available information is sort of confirming your decision, then why would you persist and force yourself to continue to do something that really isn't either getting you excited anymore, or all indications are that you should probably walk away.
Mm-hmm.
And that, honestly, that's part of the coaching process that I do is sort of, I can't make a decision for someone, but I want to put them in the best possible position to make a decision with confidence. What information do we need to gather that would help you make a good decision here? And even if the result of the decision is bad, this is something I've been talking to my daughter about, like, you still might have made the right decision. The result is not necessarily an indicator that the decision was bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the result.
Yeah.
But based on the available information you have, you could have still made the right decision.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Are there any topics or questions that I might have missed asking you as we wind down the conversation today, Rob?
Oh, we could talk about so many things, but no, I really appreciate it, just the opportunity to chat and to talk with someone else who's sort of discovering this at this age and figuring out what it means for them. I guess I'm curious about, if, like many folks with ADHD, your report card when you were younger, I don't know what the system was like in Canada, was reflective, and did you have in a moment where you went, oh my gosh, this explains so much of my early childhood years, not just, the struggles as an adult?
Yeah, it's funny you should ask that, actually. So my mom kept my report cards from kindergarten all the way up to high school or some of high school. That's a different story. I think the schools probably burned I might not have lasted in the school long enough to get a report card, but I digress. Yes. And so I've had these report cards in a box in my office closet, for 16 years since we moved to Nashville. And my wife and I, when I was diagnosed pretty recently, I was going through some stuff and happened upon them. And so cracked them all open, and we were like the poor teachers that I had. But we were just laughing our heads off at the comments, because the comments are all exactly as you would expect. Dave makes bad decisions, won't sit still, class clown, yada, yada, yada.
He's a very bright student.
Yes, but
he needs to focus. He needs to.
Yep.
That was Robbie is very bright. I was just telling someone yesterday that I was the kid who was moved every position next to the teacher, sat by myself, sat with the quiet kids, sat with the talkative kids.
In the hallway.
Didn't matter. Yeah. Anything.
Yeah.
And there were certain teachers who were more patient than others, but there were a couple along the way that really just had no patience for me.
Yeah.
And I tell you, for them.
Yes. Yeah, no, it was the same for me. In fact, I failed. I think I probably failed all 7 years, and the teacher just put me in the next grade so that they could be done with me. And it was finally my 7th grade teacher, Mr. Pat Riley, who finally held me back. He's like, all right, hold on a second. And he was actually great. He was the type, when I first had him, where I had a detention with him, and it was like very early on, and he'd given me detention for whatever reason. And I thought, I don't remember whether it was like disrespect, and I just said, forget that, I'm going home, or whether I actually forgot, which is possible too. But I did go home and skip the detention. And this is, of course, the 1970s. So next thing I know, I'm in the basement of my house with my brother watching, Three's Company probably. And the doorbell rings, and I hear upstairs my mom answer the door, and she's like surprised. She's like, Mr. Riley, like, what can I do for you? And he came in and he said, oh yeah, David forgot his detention, so I'm here to pick him up. And he drove me back to school. So
wow.
Yeah. School was definitely an interesting ride for me, man.
Yeah, well, I mean, that I think a lot of kids with ADHD, for me, it was always the busy work that I objected to, or again, this sort of gets to the sort of formula stuff, like geometry, like I could get it. I got the concepts, but I had no patience for writing out all the proofs and the work, showing my work and things like that. So kind of like, no, I don't want to follow this rule or show you how I got it. I got it. Kind of got it, but and of course they were somewhat right. They were, like if I if you get it wrong, I can't show you where you got it wrong, but if you don't show your work. But I hated anything that had to be done that didn't make sense to me, or, to do like a tedious, homework assignment, busy work.
Yeah.
I never did that. So my grades were, not the best.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny when you look back and you're like, oh yeah, that does explain a lot. And, certainly that is part of my journey right now. Oh, Rob, man, this has been awesome. How can people get a hold of you, learn more about what you do, buy your book?
Yeah. Well, the easiest way is robhatch.com is where I set up shop. And the book is called Attention, The Power of Simple Decisions in a Distracted World. You can get that in all the Amazon-y places and books, other places you buy books.
Yep.
And, the next book is called Success Frames, Why Learning from Success is the Key to What Motivates and Inspires Us. So that'll be out, I think, before the end of the year.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure, and I'll include links to stuff that we talked about here in the show notes so people can click over and check you out. All right. Well, Rob, thanks so much. This has been fun.
Dave, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Wise Squirrels. I'm Dave Delaney. The music to the show is Unyielding Conditioning by the one and only Fishbone. And you can find that song and all of Fishbone's music wherever you stream music. We thank them for this. We love Fishbone.